Okay. Well, listen, guys, without further ado, as I say, listen, it's great to be here, and thanks for joining on a late evening. It always shows the kind of the dedication people have when they're willing to put in the hours. So, um, as I kind of said before, I'm with 10 years at Enterprise Ireland in the startup unit team, and a lot has changed in the 10 years. Like, technology moves at a kind of a frantic pace. The one thing that really hasn't changed one iota is how difficult it is to raise money for a startup, and that is the perennial difficulty that every early stage company has. Unlike a kind of a new law firm or a new coffee shop, even, it's not something that traditional finance has any interest in still, in Ireland. So finding money is a kind of a constant struggle and a constant difficulty. So to be perfectly honest, it is probably the most unpleasant and unenjoyable part of doing a startup. But the reality is, it's an absolute requirement. It's, some businesses you can scale kind of, bootstrapping. In my experience, most startups, they can usually just scale them to the point where either you're earning 20,000 a year, putting in kind of 120-hour days, or some larger competitor just spots you and picks you up before you even have a chance to grow it to that level. So money plus talent plus luck is really the magical formula here. So I'm here to talk about the funding part of it. So yeah, just for that, I'm just going to talk through, again, I'm sure many of you have read all the interesting books around Silicon Valley and Palo Alto, and the various guides about rising a startup. Those can often be very misleading. Kind of, Palo Alto is a very different place from Ireland, as different as kind of Disneyland is from Dublin. So I'm just going to just put in context what the traditional Irish kind of startup funding rounds sizes are, from kind of low to kind of exit. Then I'm just going to break them down kind of stage by stage. So first, we're going to talk about the local enterprise office and Microfinance Ireland. Then around my side of the house and our larger investments. And then finally, kind of from Series A and above, dealing with the venture capital funds. I've got Q&A at the end, but look, I'm quite happy to take questions. Romal, I might ask you to keep an eye out for hands raised, as I'm kind of in the sharing mode here. But if anybody wants to cut in, ask a question as we go, I'm always willing to take it as we go. So yeah, so look, these are the traditional kind of breakdowns. There's many different names for the kind of stages, but this is how I always like to see it, as the kind of the journey from kind of very early stage idea, where kind of I'd say most of you guys are at, right up to the kind of Series A kind of exit stage. And from an Irish perspective, this is kind of the rough breakdown, and you can kind of see there in terms of who you engage with on across those various stages and the kind of quantums we normally see. So the kind of money you'd see here at kind of Series A, seed, like you could be talking about 25 to 100 million for seed in Palo Alto and other jurisdictions, but this is the kind of the traditional amount that we would see in Ireland. That's I think I mentioned before to some of the teams, knowing your numbers and having credibility around what is achievable is always good going into it. So I would think as you go, this is the kind of the monies you'd see in the traditional kind of enterprise solutions space, which I think most of you guys are in. So just starting off, so the first port of call is usually the local enterprise office for most kind of early stage companies. Now, there sometimes can be a bit of kind of snobbery around the local enterprise office. Kind of people would see it as kind of Bray City Wanderers compared to kind of Enterprise Ireland as kind of Manchester United. But I don't agree with that. They're very good at what they do. They're often the very first port of call for anyone coming in, like getting into EI, as I'll explain later on. We're quite selective in who we let in. We take around 200 companies a year. The Leos have a kind of a come one, come all approach. So right at the beginning, I highly advise engaging with them. There's one in every jurisdiction, with multiple in Dublin. So you're spoiled for choice wherever you are in the country. I'm not going to get into great detail about the various supports they have outside of their kind of financial supports, and they do many good things in terms of additional kind of advice. And by the way, I kind of this presentation is primarily around funding, and I guess grants would not be considered a traditional source of equity investment, but I think any foxhole in a war, and these can often be the first things to get you to the point where you can really demonstrate value for your company. So to be a Leo company, you have to be manufacturing, you have to be trading internationally, you have to have export focused, and it can't be a kind of a traditional kind of retail or trading or a consultancy business, very similar to what EI has. So as long as you're selling stuff overseas and the capacity to do it, you can engage the Leo client. And there are multiple other grants, very specific ones around decarbonizing your product and kind of other things. But my experience is these grants here, the six on the right, are the best ones if you really want to think of it as kind of raw cash that can kind of grow your business from raw idea into something that probably might attract the eye of EI or an angel investor. So a feasibility grant is one of the most attractives out there. It covers basically, and the clue is in the name here. This is to allow you to figure out whether the business is potentially feasible. So it's not most people use it to do in-depth market research, build a basic minimal viable product, and just determine whether this thing might have traction. I guess the difference with the Leo from Enterprise Ireland is it only covers half of the costs, and it's we can't do retroactive payments. And also, it's important to note that these payments come in after you spend the money. So you've got to reach into your own pocket, spend these costs, and then the Leo recomps the budget, which can sometimes be painful, but that's just the way the Leo is structured. So feasibility is extremely popular option. They go out the door all the time. Very good at just getting you to that point where you can be like, you know what, I'm not going to raise a ton of money or throw my life away on a concept that's not feasible until you determine that it is. Another very popular one is the innovation voucher. This allows you to kind of basically develop a kind of a complex product. It's not a lot of money, 10K in the scheme of things is very small, but it'll cover any kind of technical development that you develop. So let's say you get your feasibility, you determine that your MVP has got a market, and you think, okay, I need to build out a kind of a complicated back end AI piece or a complicated bot piece, whatever is required, or even a complicated piece of market research and development, customer insights. You can go to the universities and basically you pay them the 10,000 from the Leo, and they do the work for you. You can get 3 with the fourth up to 50% funded. You do have to be incorporated before you get this, which is sometimes a limitation in some companies. I never recommend incorporating too early because it basically starts the clock on some other supports. But again, it's just a requirement the Leos have, and you want to do it. The advice I have if you are going down this route is to be really specific around what you ask for and to get bang for your buck. Not to knock my colleagues in universities. Of course, I'm speaking to one right here. The universities love these grants because they're a kind of additional source of revenue, kind of like grants and all that kind of stuff they get. But they're very eager to kind of do it very quickly, get it out the door, and get back to kind of using the money for their research. So if you go to them with a very vague proposition like, can you figure out whether there's a market for this product, or can you do a bit of market research? They'll absolutely do it. They'll spend the money, and before you know it, you've got a kind of a pretty basic product. Or if you come to them and say, with a very basic thing like, can you build me a website? They will say, sure. And this day and age, you should not be spending 10,000 on a website with no coding, with the various kind of open source tools. That's kind of stuff you do yourself. So use the money for stuff that I would say that you cannot do yourself or requires real expertise. This is another kind of attractive one. A big part I always think of any startup is just proving categorically your customer exists. I think we covered this time and time again in the various in the session we ran a couple of weeks ago with you guys. That if there's all I really care about from my perspective as an investor is there a customer, and is there enough of them that they can pay to get this thing moving? So figuring that out is a very difficult task. I mentioned the mom test as my favorite, and I think the definitive Bible for startups. It's the only book I recommend really to read for every single company, and that's all around just validating your idea. But often that can be quite difficult. If you've got a business to consumer product, you can kind of reach out to your friends and family or do a survey monkey. But I think, most successful businesses are aiming for specific sectors. You're aiming for the dentistry market to kind of figure out some dentistry tool or whatever, you know what I mean? Hyper focused markets. And really the only way to reach these companies in mass rather than doing a bunch of shoe leather is to go to trade shows. So I always recommend that at the early stage, getting to highly specific technical trade shows and just bombarding the entire audience with as much interviews as you can do is really valuable. But trade shows in and of themselves are quite expensive. So this grant I always recommend as well worth drawing down. It covers half the cost of attending any kind of trade show. So look, it won't cover all the costs, and often you've got to reach into your own pocket. But this is a way to get a ticket, get there, get your market research. Never worth missing up. And then the two most popular ones, once the business is up and running, and again, it's you have to be incorporated, you have to have staff. Probably most of you guys, this is kind of the end point of the Leo. I think most of those other ones can be kind of a one-man band. This is when you've kind of reached the point where you actually are growing a business. So the priming grant and the business expansion grant are both very popular. They're both broadly similar, and basically they can offer grants up to 50K in the case of the priming and 80K in the business expansion. Look, not a lot of money in the scheme of things. Again, it's in the form of a grant, so it's repayable. But as a source of funding, if you're really early and you're really hard up, can make the difference in getting this business up and running. So they're my prime Leo grants. And sorry, the trading online voucher. This deck is a little bit old. The trading online voucher name has changed, and I'm sure I can Google it and send it on to you afterwards. But broadly, it's to develop a website. It covers half the costs of it. I mentioned before, I think a professional website is really important. If you come to me, give me a business card and say, I've got this company called Merrill Electronics, and I Google it, and all I can find is a LinkedIn profile, it just looks a bit shabby. So I always recommend having a professional website. And really all you have to do is to attend a kind of a course on this. It's a webinar session, and you get this 2,500. I think all of us here on the call have done an awful lot worse for 3 hours of your time. And just to flag here, just the points on the left, which often get confused. It can cover you, say, building your own website using kind of Squarespace or one of those. It has to be for outside costs. It can be for non-for-profits, and it has to be a Leo company. It has to be for importing and distributing your business. But all of those together, are a good start on your funding journey to get your business to the point where you should be moving to the next level, which is my side of the house. And finally, many of those grants that I mentioned are paid out of your own pocket, which can be a big ask for a lot of people. So one of the advantages is an agency called Microfinance Ireland. This was set up after the financial crisis, when basically the banks moved out of doing any kind of micro loans to small businesses. So they can offer basically micro loans through the Leo. If you go directly through the Leo, which I always recommend, they'll offer you a reduction on the interest rate. So basically, they can pay you the money upfront, and then you can use that then to pay off the Leo. It's a bit circular. I know it seems a bit mad, but again, we always have to think creatively in the startup game. Okay, so I'm just moving on to Enterprise Ireland. So, EI, what is our focus? We're an expert-focused business. Our job basically is more about job creation than anything. We bring just as IDA brings businesses to Ireland, we bring small companies like yourself, theoretically, to the world. Most EI companies are kind of big, kind of fairly unsexy, unglamorous businesses, kind of, brick manufacturers, window manufacturing, cheese makers down the west. Those are really where the mass jobs are, to be perfectly honest. But I sit in a specialized unit within the EI, which is the High Potential Startup Unit, or the EI Startup Unit. And our focus is on really the kind of companies that you guys are looking at doing, the kind of the small, innovative, disruptive tech companies, the Bobby Healy's, the Mana Drones, the Equal One Quantum Computing, which again came out of Nova Labs on the UCD side of the house, frontier technologies. And we, unlike the rest of the EI, we actually do equity investments, as in we will sit on the cap table and we will put proper liquid cash into the business, not just grants. Why do we do that? It's a lot of people think, and certainly overseas investors would find this quite strange. The simple answer is there's very little access to early stage capital in Ireland. We are the lender of last resort. If we weren't there, it'd be, most companies would probably hit the terminal level before they could scale. So we have 3 different equity offers that we do, which I'll talk through in more detail. Our naming conventions are all over the place, as any good public sector body is. But I like to think of them just as 3 key kind of hop, skip, and the jumps, which is the pre-seed investment, the seed investment, and the post-seed investment. So in our experience, and again, EI is not in the business of as I say, we're doing this more as a kind of a requirement than a want. Our goal really is to kind of get your company up and running, get the state out of your hair as quickly as possible, let private money step in, and then we exit stage left, returning the money to the taxpayer. Everyone's happy. So over the years, we found that these 3 hop, skip, and a jumps has been what's required to get you to that VC out the door level, and that's why we've constructed them. So the pre-seed start fund, that's the first one, and that's primarily my role is managing and working on this team. So this is the first bite of the apple. This is kind of the seed investment to kind of get you to the point where you're able to raise matched funding from a private investors within 6 to 14 months. And on my experiences, the best companies raise it within um, 100K is not that much money in the scheme of things. So most companies were really getting them on a speed run of 6 to 8 to 10 months to get them to that matching round. The advantage of this is it really requires very little matched funding. So basically, we ask for 5K against each 50,000. So in theory, you could put 5K in and get 50K. I've never seen anyone do that. Like, you might as well take the full 100,000. As I mentioned, it's not that much money, and most businesses will need this. And the advantage of this is you're basically brought into the EI family. You get an EI client advisor who will work with you very closely on overseas market access and all the other interesting stuff that EI does. We get you in with a professional mentor, and there's also a bunch of other supports, which I'm not going to get into a great deal here. I'm going to focus on the funding, but we have an awful lot of access to, say, discounted cloud credits through our partnerships with the multinationals, deep insights into what overseas markets are looking for. So we have all that kind of, trade information, and also some additional grant supports, which are very juicy, and I'll get into towards the end of this presentation. So how does it work? It's a relatively straightforward process by the standards of government and by the standards of investment. Let's put it that way. So basically, there's a paper application and a video application you have to submit. The paper application is quite long and detailed, but that's what ChatGPT is for. The video pitch is kind of very similar to what you guys gave us on the in the pitching sessions when we did it last week or the week before. Basically, it's a 4-minute pitch that comes to me and my team. We evaluate it, we assign a score, and if it hits a certain threshold, you get called in, and then it gets assigned to be an interview panel with whatever sector you're working in. So if you're a fintech company, you meet the fintech manager and 2 of the fintech employees, and they just grill you for an hour on every aspect of the business, very similar to any traditional investor, interview. All going well, and again, if that works out, we approve you, we get the legals done and dusted, and then we're paid into you. So average turnaround time is around 90 days, although we've tried to get that down. But realistically, if you applied tomorrow, that's about the time you'd expect. So don't expect, instantaneous money. We approved 84 last year. We're going to look at 100 this year. Again, that's not a kind of a ceiling. That's if 150 or 200 brilliant companies come into us, EA is not going to be kicking them out of bed. So don't feel like you've got to scramble to hit some kind of end of year deadline if this is something you really want to do. And just in terms of how the money goes in, and this applies to both this and the seed stage investment, apart from the alternate term, which I'll come to in a minute, the money goes in as a convertible loan note. So a CLN is different from a kind of a classic kind of, again, Silicon Valley, Palo Alto investment, which is usually an equity split, as in they will take X percentage of the business at a pre-money or post-money valuation of that. So they're taking a slice out of you, and that slice is their holding. A CLN is more like, I guess, the traditional relationship between a kind of a mortgage holder and a bank. The bank, we give you the money, you will pay it back over a certain amount of time, and then eventually, with a bit of interest. And at no point do the bank say, okay, we've got a stake in this house, and if it increases in value, we can make you sell it. So that's the real advantage of it. So the two great evaluations for you is you own 100% of the shares. So EI is never sitting on the cap table at the start. So that allows you to keep control. And it also allows delayed valuation, which is so important. Like, Americans have this absolute fetish for putting a valuation in early stage companies. You see all these kind of AI companies kind of getting, 4 million at kind of, 40 billion post revenue who've only just arrived. Like, I've been doing this business for a long time. That's just kind of voodoo, kind of complete kind of spin the wheel kind of valuation. It takes at least a couple of years before we can really figure out how much value we can put on the company. And at that point, then we can do it. So from everyone's perspective, it's a good value. I guess the one thing to note that makes this different from a home loan is if this business really takes off, as in if a kind of a VC comes in and they say, okay, this thing is flying, we're going to value this at kind of 20 million at a post 100 million, whatever. It isn't a case of you being able to say, thank you, Enterprise Ireland, here's your 100,000. pat you on the back and go out the door. What we have the right to do is convert, as is obvious from the name, in those conditions to convert into equity. That's the kind of the winner's premium we get from backing you at the start. So, rather than it just being a case of us loaning you 100K, we're hoping that this business takes off. And look, the reality is, startups by their nature, most of them fail. This is the mechanism we build in to make sure that essentially the taxpayer isn't getting screwed over. Most startups, of the 90 HPSUs that we'll take this year, probably 20 will succeed and hit that superstar level. They'll 5x or 10x, and all that money pays off the rest of the guys. It's a classic VC model. So that's why we create these conditions. So look, it's a winner for everyone. Let's put it that way. Yeah, and look, I've mentioned that before. So just in terms of the details. So if it's a case where the business doesn't take off and it essentially becomes a good, 7-employee kind of, 1 million a year, nice business, but not a superstar. It's at that point then we'll basically start calling in the loan. It's on a simple 3% interest rate, which is very competitive in terms to any private money you take on. We usually look at it over a 5-year period, although EI isn't, we're not a bank. We're not going to be breaking your legs or breaking down your door. We look very closely at whether this is going to destabilize the business. If you say, we're really cash tight, but we're making this thing work, we'll often push it out for an extended period. And in a conversion bent, we received a 20% discount on the share price. That's another kind of winner advantage that EI has for backing you at this very early state. So again, I just on this, to be eligible for it, it's very similar to all the EI terms. You have to be a manufacturing or export focused business. It has to be innovation, less than 4 years old, revenues less than 150,000, and you shouldn't have raised more than 200,000, which I assume applies to everyone in the group here. So look, that's just a given. And by the way, the BICs, the Business Innovation Centers, who they run monthly webinars doing a deep dive on this topic. I highly recommend. They're free. You can do them online. Just go into any of the big websites, depending on your region, log in, and they'll do a much more detailed talk than I'm doing here. This is just a pure whistle-stop tour from my perspective. And then in terms of if you're thinking of applying for this, people often say, like, is there a kind of a secret sauce? And they always assume that I can kind of help them kind of, and like they're always kind of saying to me, like, what's the secret to getting this? There's no magic to PSSF. Like, what makes a good business is, and it's kind of very similar to the questions we were grilling you guys were on last week. So just in your own benefit, the question marking groupings on the application are organized on scale from 1 to 6 here. And this is it's 1 has the highest points and down. So we really look very closely at team. Considering early stage most of these businesses are, it's very difficult to determine whether the thing has really got legs. So our real interest is, okay, does this team have the skills? Do they know the area? Are they the kind of people we can back? So we love looking at that very closely. And also I'd recommend, bringing in mentors, although they mightn't fit formally on your job team. Seeing a really good mentor on a cap table is very attractive, or on an application is good for us. If your business is, I don't know, hotel management software, and you've got kind of the chairman of Delata Hotel Groups on it, and he's engaged with the business, that for us is a real validation. We're like, okay, well, if anyone knows hotels, it's this guy. It's just one more piece of evidence we can have to make ourselves feel confident this thing might have legs. Again, very simple. I'd always recommend, this is my magic formula for all startups: clearly identified problem, clearly identified solution, and clearly identified who will pay for it, and is there enough of them of it. Again, it has to be innovative. We want this to be a high potential startup. Is it a B2B or a B2C? Look, we do invest in business to consumer, but B2B is just always more attractive for us, as it is for every professional investor. It's just the nature of the game. The stage of the business. Have you got an MVP? Have you got validation? Are people using it? In a perfect world, they're paying you, but even some good evidence of kind of, the validation there in the next point, trials, paid trials, just evidence that this thing is actually working. Again, one more kind of piece of evidence that we can say this thing has probably got legs. And then finally, there's a big section on milestone planning. It seems quite arbitrary, but I'd always recommend filling it in detail. It can sometimes be the difference between getting you that final couple of points to get called to interview and not. So And by the way, anyone on the call, if you're thinking of going for this, I'm quite happy to do a follow-on call to talk you through the application in more detail. The video, again, I'm not going to drain this too much. It's 4 minutes long. It's usually a PowerPoint walkthrough. I always recommend those 4 sections I talked about: problem, solution, team. A lot of people feel, okay, I've got 4 minutes. I've got to absolutely kind of I've got to throw everything into this. And often it can become a case where they're just racing through tons of data and we're completely confused as to what's going on. My advice always is use the paper application for the detail, use the video just to kind of get our attention, get our interest. Very similar to what most of you guys did in the pitching session. I think you've really got that skill down. So don't go down a deep technical rabbit hole and just professionalize it. Practice, and there are various supports, the Bix and Pitch Jam and other ones will help you with to kind of get your pitching down tight. Although you've clearly been working on this very effectively on the program here, so I think you guys are one step ahead on that one. Then again, as I mentioned, the interview is a kind of a deep dive on the company. What we're really looking for here is how you're going to spend the 100K. And be, again, really realistic as to what 100K can get you for. If you're saying, I'm going to hire 10 employees and I'm going to do this, that, and wherever, it'll just undermine your credibility. So just square out the 100K. Think really hard. Okay, where's 100K going to get me? And really what they want to hear is, this 100K is going, for the next 6 months, is going to get me to the point where I'm going to come back to you guys and get a matching investment, and on we go. For us, it's all about deal flow through getting PSSF and then moving you up the ladder, scaling exponentially. Okay, so I talked about scale. So the next rung up, everything going well. You've got your 100, you've got your PSF, you've spent it down, you've hired people, you've got your customers, the business is moving. Now we're moving towards the kind of seed investment stage. So look, if you go online, it'll say that it's up to 1 million, and there is a real desire in EI to do larger rounds going forward. You might have seen an article about this in the Sunday Business Post a couple of days ago. But to be perfectly honest, the vast majority of investments we do would be in the kind of 200 to 300 to 400-ish range now. And that's matched against money from an independent investor. So that's what makes that different from the pre-seed. In this case, you've got to get an angel or a VC or someone to match the investment to unlock the EI money. The money then goes in as a CLN, identical to what I was banging on about earlier. The only exception to this case is if you've got a professional investor. So what we consider a professional investor is a registered venture capital fund. In those circumstances, we match their terms identically. So whatever they're getting, we get it. It's just a long history of EI getting shafted by sharkish VCs has led to this. So it's just the nature of the game. Once upon a time, it used to be kind of 2 to 1. We'd expect you, if you were getting 250 from us, we'd expect you to raise $500,000. Over COVID, we kind of went down to 1 to 1, and now it's kind of just the way it is. So it's basically 1 to 1 investment. Although we like to see a bit more money, and sometimes from the co-investor. But just the long story short, it's basically become 1 to 1. We're never the lead investor. We don't take any board seats, so we will never be involved in any kind of shenanigans around board votes, whatever. It takes us out of the play. We'll never have more than 10% equity in an equity conversion event, either this or with the VC play. And usually repayment, again, takes place after the company is sold, through dividends, or when the company is acquired or becomes profitable. Again, that's what I mentioned. We're not in the business of trying to squeeze you for cash. In the perfect world, we want to see a successful business hiring people, growing, and being supported by BIE. So, most companies that are like Equal One, Mana Drones, big companies, they still have EI sit on their equity table because we cause no trouble. We're not a voting member. They get all the EI supports, and in many ways, it's a badge of honor. EI takes its great pride in it, and good investors like Bobby and Jason over at Equal One realize that. So, it's certainly if there's an equity case where you wanted us out, we're never going to fight you as long as we get our fair share. But I think long story short, you kind of want us in there for the long haul. And then the second one, the post-seed, is actually identical to the previous one in almost every single way. For most of my time in EI, the post-seed was kind of a rarity. I'd have said in my first 6 or so years in the organization, maybe 20% of HPSUs got post-seed. But as kind of venture capital funds kind of dried up during COVID, as it kind of moved upstream to bigger rounds, more and more of our companies have required it. So I'd say last year, I think around 70% of the good HPSUs took post-seed. Again, this is exactly the same as the previous one. We're matching money against private angels. The only difference here is we can't bail you out. So if you came to me and said, Michael, the business is about to go under, but I've got an emergency loan, from my investors. In those circumstances, unfortunately, I can't help you. It has to be for scaling. So that sometimes seems unfair and can often be really frustrating for companies. But EI, from a taxpayer perspective, we can't be in the business of kind of bailing out failed companies. It's just not in our remit. So that's the one thing to note on that. And I think one of the really attractive things about becoming a kind of seed investment. Now, this doesn't apply to the pre-seed start fund. It only applies to the seed and post-seed. You get access to what's called de minimis state aid. So that's basically grant support available through the EU that allows basically governments for small companies to kind of put our fingers on the scale and help them to grow in a competitive environment. So every company can access 300. Sorry, actually, this is a bit old now. It's now 350,000 of essentially non-repayable, non-dilutable state aid. So that goes in the form of grants. It's not it's not like the previous one. It's not a big bag of money we give to you. But in many ways, I find this is even more attractive for startups because, the clue again is in those two things I say below. It's non-repayable. You're never going to have to pay that money back, and will have no effect on your cap table. And the grants it can pay towards are really costs that you're going to accrue in the business anyway. So you'd be mad not to draw it down. There's many of them, just like I mentioned, the Leo, there's tons of them for cybersecurity and for green change and green consultancy and lean management consultancy. I go on and on and on. There's thousands of the fucking things. But if you're talking about ones that actually really meaningfully affect your business and actually are in many ways kind of, stuff you would spend cash on anyway, these are the kind of the couple here at the top are the ones I really love. So the Market Discovery Grant Fund basically will give you 150,000. Now that varies depending on the number of employees you have, but if you have up to 4 employees, you can draw down 150,000 for any kind of overseas exploratory work. So if you're going to trade shows, if you're hiring consultants overseas to do market research for you, if you're hiring an ad agency to develop you actually can't go to marketing, but a kind of an agency that's helping you, make, cold intros and warm intros to suppliers, all that can come out of that. And those are things that are going to become basic elements of any startup. So all those costs you can get rid of, really attractive. The second one I love is the Key Manager Grant. So look, outside of raising money, the second biggest challenge you're going to have as a startup is acquiring good talent. Google and the multinationals pay people an incredible amount of money. So hiring really good technical resources can be very difficult on the kind of budgets you are. So what we offer is essentially, if you're making a key leadership hire, we can essentially subsidize their salary 50-50 up to 150,000. So say if you had someone, a really good person who said, look, I can offer you 140,000 and a bit of equity in the business, EI will then cover half of that. So you're basically only paying them 70,000. So that might be just enough to kind of get a really good talent in through the door, which again, you can often be the maker of a good business. It'll cover any kind of key leadership hire with the exception of sales and marketing. We can never use money to subsidize sales and marketing. Then the grant for the grad start one, criminally underused by companies. I spend my time, like John the Baptist, talking about this to my companies. We'll cover half the cost of a salary for 3 graduates for 2 years. And look, you can put those graduates to work. They're young, they're hungry, they can live on ramen, they're eager for experience. You can work them like a dog while you develop the high, so it means that you're not doing all the kind of the nitty-gritty detail. They're doing it. It's a mad thing not to draw down. So I'd really recommend it. Mentor grants, yeah, that's good. But a really good mentor is something that can often be hard to find. So we'll cover the costs of that, finding you a mentor, matching you, giving them basically a kind of a little subsidy to run their sessions with you. And in many cases, that relationship lasts beyond the first 10. And again, I've already mentioned the innovation voucher. It is available from EI as well. And I always recommend, if companies haven't used it, to use it. You're just leaving money on the table otherwise. So look, those are all really attractive. So that 350,000 refreshes every 3 years. So you wouldn't believe the amount of time I spend with my companies begging them to not leave the money on the table, because the clock resets. And in many cases, I'm pulling my hair out where I've got startups who've got a kind of 150,000 or 200,000 balance, and then it resets after 3 years and that money's gone. So this is a kind of a Brewster's Million situation. You've got to spend down the money. You'd be mad not to, but you'd be amazed the number of companies that don't. And then finally, I've talked a lot about kind of matching funding and angels. I'm just going to speak through where that source of money in Ireland would traditionally come from. So, VCs are really attractive and everybody wants to have VC, but to be pretty honest, I'd say VCs make up, I haven't got the stat at the top of my hand, but I'd say no more than kind of 35% of our matched HPSU investments each year. They're a small, highly selective part of the ecosystem. So most people, when they come to us, their co-investor is an angel. And those are usually wealthy people with cash in their hands and are eager to kind of, get involved with a startup. I mentioned there the chairman of Delata. The reason that comes to mind is he is co-investing in a company that I'm looking at right now. He's got lots of cash, he's got lots of time, and he wants to be involved. So my advice on this is always try and find an angel investor that actually has a specialty in your area. So just like that hotel management software, he knows it. So not only is he providing cash, but he's also providing kind of advice, industry connections, overall advice. He basically becomes a member of the startup team, but he's probably just sitting back a wee bit on his laurels while you do the hard work. But look, that's what investors get to do. So look, angels are good as a kickoff, but they usually don't do kind of larger rounds. So if you're looking at raising kind of upwards of 5 to 6 million, there isn't many angels who will do that. This should be for your first kind of bite of the apple, that 250 to kind of 500,000. They're the ones you should be looking at. And again, the perennial question I get asked by everyone is, okay, where do I find these people? Are they all kind of gathered together in one room? And can I kind of talk to them? The reality is doesn't really work like that, primarily because, they don't want to be bothered by people. They don't want to be nagged by thousands of people, send them emails, calling them up. They're often quite selective. So kind of hunting them down in the wild is a skill in of itself. Most people find them through kind of existing business connections, family or personal, which I know seems kind of unfair, but that's just the reality of the game. Now, the only exception to that rule would be the H-band. This is the kind of formalized network that EI manages that tries to put a bit of structure on the diverse angel network. So H-band work as kind of group of angel investors. It's a very common concept that came out of Palo Alto, where basically all these angels kind of group together and basically kind of, either invest together or, all the work of kind of seeing the pitching decks, seeing the quality is handled by a third-party body. So EI supports this, and it's been subcontracted to Dogpatch Labs. So basically they do the hard work of finding companies, getting them together. You can apply on their website, but they're also at every single pitching event, every single event that EI offers. H-band's there, looking at the list, looking at the companies, trying to come up with connections. And then over various periods of the year, they'll bring them in, they'll put them in front of the 700 members. Usually, I think it's always a Zoom session now. It used to be in person, but now they're all Zoom. You pitch just like you're pitching for PSSF. And then the members go away, and it's kind of like Dragon's Den. Some of them go in together. Sometimes they do it individually. The rounds can vary, and because they often group together, it can be bigger than the kind of the 250. That's if you're thinking, okay, I have no idea how I'll find an angel, that's about as easy as you're going to get it. But H-band is very selective. They're quite picky about who they put in front of their panel. So it's not a case of just give them their deck and you'll get in front of them. So just think of it again as that kind of competitive PSSF process. You're going to be pitching yourself hard to get in the room with these guys. Another very popular source of kind of private money now is Spark. This is kind of crowd-funded investment. I think you guys would all be familiar with the concept. This is a case where basically it's kind of like a kind of a digitalized version of H-band, except it involves far more small retail investors. So often many rounds would have kind of, if we're talking about 100K to 600K, there could be 50 to 100 to 200 people involved, all getting little pieces of it, and Spark manages that deal. They actually are quite prolific. I was kind of dubious about them for a while, but they are doing bigger and bigger rounds. I just was in a meeting in the Guinness Enterprise Centre today and found out they've done a match. They've raised 3 million to match against an EI investment. Highly unusual, but they seemingly are in the game, and it's something you can again apply for via their platform. So If any of you are coming to Startup Day next week, I think the guys extended the invitation. Spark will be there, always willing to have a conversation. The only thing I'd say is having that many small investors, even structured with the kind of vehicles Spark have, can sometimes be a real pain in the neck. Any kind of decisions, dilution, sales. It's government by committee. It's trying to put a bunch of cats in a sack. So look, I'd recommend going with a single investor or a VC, but that's the nature of the game. The real advantage, by the way, of HBAN is they invest as a block, so there isn't that kind of individual voting rights section. So yeah, look at them, but yeah, be wary. And then very finally, just on the venture capital investment in Ireland. So look, Ireland's VC network is relatively small. I'll be perfectly honest. We're not a country that loves kind of high risk investments. We prefer property and other safe bets like that. But there are some very good ones out there. And again, I mentioned Startup Day. Every single established VC will be there at a booth, at the stand. If you ever wanted to shoot all your fish in the barrel, that's next Wednesday. So please come along. The best ones would be there's a load of them, but Frontline, Act, Atlantic Bridge, Finch, Middle Game Ventures. I can go on and on and on. If you ask ChatGPT who are the best ones, I'm sure it'll pull it out for you very quickly. Or you can come to Startup Day and see them all in one go. They're generally upstream, as I mentioned. So they're not looking to do small investments. They're looking to do kind of 5x, 10x's quickly. They will do 1 million, but I'd say most of them are now in the kind of 5 million matched range. But to be very honest, if they see something they really like, they'll sometimes make exceptions. Most of them have a sectoral focus. Finch, very heavily involved in AI, but actually that's now ubiquitous because everyone's into AI. Frontline was very good in the AR VR space. Atlantic Bridge loves deep tech university spinouts. So my advice to you is do a bit of research. If you're a food company, 0 point reaching out to Finch or Frontline. They're just not going to come back to you. So try and figure out what VC most closely matches your company profile. And again, a lot of people say to me, "Well, okay, that's way down the stream. Why are you talking about it now?" My advice to you is, sorry, this deck is a bit old. We're past 25, but all these companies are building their 26, 27, 28 pipeline. They're making the connections. They're looking at companies. If you go along to Startup Day and shake hands with Niall McAvoy from Elkstone and say, very early stage, going for PSSF, but I think I'd like to sit down with you eventually. You've made that initial connection. It's the more you meet them, the more you build it up. And the next time you meet them, when you go to PSF and you're trucking, you can say, "Niall, we met at Startup Day. The ice is broken. It's all about kind of basically plowing the road ahead of you. Getting that connection going. So never too early to engage with any of these guys." And again, by the standards of Silicon Valley, they're very approachable people. They run loads of events, Dublin Tech Summit. My advice is just set up, once you decide who you might want to invest, set up a Google ping alert on events and just see, Frontline's running a drinks event, Finch is going to be at Dublin Tech Summit speaking, and just make it your business to meet them and meet them as often as you can. So that, guys, I hope that's not too much of a fire hose of information. I will send this deck over to you and you can circulate so you have some more information. At the end of the deck, I've embedded a kind of, I set aside parts of every week just to do kind of open meetings with anyone who wants to discuss their idea or where they want to go. So please don't hesitate to reach out. You're a taxpayer. I'm a public servant. I work for you. So no question too small, no problem too big. It's tough. Startups are tough. There's an awful lot easier works out there, but it's really important. Ireland is entirely too reliant on the multinational sector. That thing is eventually going to pop, and the only way we're going to dig ourselves out of the hole is lots of really good indigenous companies. So if you think you're going to do it, EI is here to back you all the way. So best of luck with it. And if you have any questions now, I'm quite happy to stay on as long as you guys like.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was fantastic.